Okay, welcome back. History 6C, this is Klein. This is our first lecture dealing with a period of history known as the Enlightenment. Um, Look, defining the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is in the 18th century, really starting back as far as the 16th century. It is really when Western society becomes modern Western society, is when modern Western humans begin. And we're going to get to that, guys. But I need to first make sure that we're all on the same page and make sure that I don't know what you've done, what you haven't done. So I'm going to do a very general kind of over survey here to get us up the Enlightenment when it comes to Western culture. So here we go. Okay? When we talk about Western culture, what we're talking about primarily is Western Europe, the culture that developed in Western Europe, and wherever that culture became a dominant influence, Eastern Europe, North America, other smaller parts of the world. When we talk about Western culture, what we're talking about is a society that has a philosophy that comes directly from the ancient Greeks. The Greeks are the beginnings of Western civilization. That's not to say that the Greeks were created in a vacuum. They're influenced by Africa, the Middle East, Asia. Many peoples in the ancient world influenced the Greeks. But it is with the Greeks that we establish Western culture. The Greeks established much of our modern philosophies, many of our sciences begin there. And they start off the classical period about 500 BC. They will continue to be dominant until really Roman civilization begins to rise in the Mediterranean. And that's, well, technically it starts around 753 BC, but Rome really becomes a dominant power around 300 BC when it begins to spread out beyond what's known as the Latium, where the region where Rome existed. Rome is a conquering nation, conquering empire. It conquers its neighbors and it takes from its neighbors what it likes. What it liked most was anything that was Greek. So if it were the Greek gods, Zeus becomes Jupiter. The Romans were pretty much the most powerful military force in the region. So if they dominated you and liked what you had, they simply took it. Greek literature, Greek philosophy, Greek gods, Greek science, much of this was simply translated into Latin and it became Roman. Greek and Roman society, up to about 300, 400 BC, or AD, 300, 400 AD, is also known as the Classical Age. But perhaps another better term or better title for this period would be known as the pre-Christian era. It is the era before Christianity becomes a dominant force in Western society. We know that Christianity begins to rise in the 1st and 2nd centuries. We know that by the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Catholic Church as we know it, the first really fully established church, Christian church in Western Europe, was established with its headquarters in Rome. And we know that for the next 1,000 years, in a period we call the Middle Ages, the Christian church, the Catholic Church, will dominate. It will tell people what they believe. It will tell people why they exist. Everything you need to know you find within the church. And perhaps more importantly, the church is the mediator between you and God. So if you want to know what Jesus wants from you, if you want to know what the Father wants from you, if you want to know they're listening to you, you go through the church. And the church tells you what to believe and how to think. 1,000 years, the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period. The church dominated all aspects of Western society. And first and foremost, what it told people was, forget the classical era. Forget the era of the Greeks and Romans that taught you about individual accomplishments and individual achievements. The Catholic Church said you are a community. Community comes first. If you look at the language or hear somebody from the medieval period, what you're going to hear mostly are words like we and us and them. They didn't have the concept of the individual. Not a lot of words like I and you. Community came first in a medieval society. In the 15th century, if you're looking at your little guidebook here, the little map, 15th century, 1453, we have the beginning of the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance in Western Europe, the word means rebirth. Renaissance means rebirth. The Renaissance in Western Europe was an attempt to rediscover pre-Christian Europe. They weren't necessarily turning their back completely on Christianity or the Catholic Church itself, but they were saying, we'd like to know what else is going on, what else went on before Christianity. And in doing so, they rediscovered the truths or the tales or the philosophies, the ideas of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The word Renaissance means rebirth. It means a rebirth of classical learning, a rebirth of classical education. And of course, out of that also became the rebirth of the importance of the individual. The Greeks and Romans had taught that the individual could do anything. Well, for 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had said the individual is not important. What's important is the community. The Renaissance period is a rediscovery of this, of the importance of the individual. The idea that I can change my life, I can do better, I should have the freedom to do so. The Renaissance will, of course, cause many, many different changes in Western culture. Economically, Western culture will, there will be an economic boom. The arts, of course, and people like Michelangelo, Da Vinci. But the institution that was most affected by the Renaissance, this new emphasis on learning and individuality and personal accomplishment, was the church, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church immediately saw a problem. They tried to stop these new philosophies. But certainly by the 16th century, the ideas of the importance of the individual had become a dominant theme in Renaissance and Western European thinking. And the result of that is going to be a split in the Christian church, a civil war. People within Christianity are going to say, we're still Christians, we still believe in Jesus Christ and the teachings of the Bible, but we don't believe in the Catholic Church. This movement was begun with Martin Luther in 1517. We call it the Protestant Reformation. Much of Southern Europe remained Catholic, focused on the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican. Much of Northern Europe, not all, but much of Northern Europe became Protestant, and the new Protestant faith was Lutheranism. One of the key aspects of Protestantism is its emphasis on individuality, the idea that I can have a relationship with God. I focus on the authority of the Bible. I have faith in Jesus Christ. But up to that, beyond that, Protestantism can be somewhat flexible. So unlike the Catholic Church, where you're either a Catholic or you're not, within Protestantism, you can have many different branches. So you began to see, after Lutheranism, you had Calvinism, and then you have Baptists, and a number of different kinds of Protestant faiths. Anglicanism began to develop. And this split in faith, interpretation of the Bible, the one book, this one book, that interpretation of the Bible created such discord within Western Europe that it resulted in open conflict. Religious wars that broke out, 16th, 17th centuries, killing hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions certainly homeless. By the 16th, 17th centuries, as these wars had started and were continuing on, there was a movement within Western Europe to start to look and say, maybe there's something wrong here. I mean, we're not turning back again on Christianity. We're just saying, wait a minute, this does not seem to make sense, that we should constantly, that a God who supposedly loves us, that we should be killing each other over this. There's something wrong here. And you began to see a movement, certainly by the 17th century, towards a more secular interpretation of the world. People started to say, hey, maybe it isn't all about God and God communicating to us. Maybe there's something else out there. In the 16th century, a man named Francis Bacon, who you'll see in your notes here, presented an idea. And his idea essentially was this. The Catholic Church for 1,000 years had said, turn your back on the science, because science was the thing of the classical period, the pre-Christian period, the Greeks and Romans. They said, you don't need science. And the Bible and God and the church will tell you what you need to know. But Francis Bacon came along and said, science is a gift from God. He said, we at one time in our existence as humans, we were perfectly happy. That was in the Garden of Eden. We lay with the Lamb. Everyone was peaceful and everything. And then we broke that covenant with God, and He kicked us out of the Garden of Eden so that we would have to struggle to survive. But Francis Bacon said, in his mercy, God gave us a gift, and that gift was science. Science, he said, will give us the ability to recreate the Garden of Eden. It's a gift from God. It's not something from a pre-Christian period. It's something we can use to recreate the harmony and the perfect society we once had. Francis Bacon didn't obviously invent the idea, but he does represent a movement that was happening certainly by the 17th century as they began to look at a more secular, non-religious view of the world. Francis Bacon and others began to argue that we need to use science to solve human problems, not simply depend on the power of the church or the faith or prayer, that we, in fact, God has given us this ability to improve ourselves. Let's use it. Out of this period, certainly by the 18th century, came a movement. We call it deism, D-E-I-S-M, deism. It's in your notes. All the great thinkers of the 18th century, most of them were deists. Most of the people who created this nation, the United States, people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they were all deists. We think of deism as, there's a metaphor for deism. It's called the Great Watchmaker Theory. So let me tell you the metaphor, and then we'll define it for you. Look, the metaphor is this. This is basically how deists try to explain what they believe. God is in his workbench one day, and he makes this fantastically beautiful watch. It's gold, it's got cogs and whistles, it's really complex, and it's beautiful, and it works perfectly. And he's on his workbench, and he puts the watch down, and he leaves his workshop, and he's gone. He's busy doing other things. He puts the watch down, and when he put the watch down, say it's a pocket watch, one little piece of that pocket watch fell out of place. Now, the watch works perfectly, but that one thing is not where it's at. What is it a metaphor for? Well, the watch is the universe, and we are that one little piece that that fell out. The watch, the universe, is a machine. And if we can figure out how the machine works, we can figure out where we belong, because obviously we're no longer where we belong. If we can find the place where we fell out of perfection, then we can have peace and harmony. How are we going to do that? Well, the universe is a machine. We have the ability for rational thought, unlike any other creature in the universe, reason. We will reason how the universe works and then be able to find our place in the universe. And once again, we will find the peace of Eden. If you're going to define the Enlightenment out of that metaphor and deism, what essentially the Enlightenment is a period that says this. First and foremost, the individual can accomplish great things. In order to do that, they need freedom, liberty. It was a very optimistic belief. It believed in progress. Humanity was constantly progressing. So we're constantly getting better through our understanding of the universe. It believed in nature. Okay, not tree-hugging nature, but nature in the sense of we should live according to the natural law. What is it God wants us to do? If we can figure that out, last but not least, what is the goal? Well, the goal in the Enlightenment was a very modern goal, what we want today, and that's when it was created. The goal is happiness. If you ask somebody in the medieval period why you exist, they would say to serve God. You ask somebody in the Enlightenment why you exist, they would say to achieve happiness. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out where we belong, where we fit in God's great watch, the great metaphor, so we can achieve happiness. The Enlightenment philosophers are all trying to find God's truth. In other words, what is the natural way for us to live? Because nature meant God, the way God wants us to live. And if we can achieve this, we achieve happiness. Now, I'm going to go in a minute and we'll come back in the second part, but let me add this little bit more definition here, guys. All right? Modern humanity, Western culture, begins with the Enlightenment. That's when you have people who think and act the way we do. It is a period in which the focus is on a secular view of the universe. It is a period in which science begins to dominate and explain why we exist and who we are. It is a period in which rational thought becomes prized above all other things. right? There'll be a second part, and we're going to go into specific thinkers.